Hey everyone, it's Jananie and welcome back to my channel, This Story Ain't Over. So April was a wildly busy month, but today I'm here to give you my April wrap up and tell you my thoughts about all 4 books that I read this month. As you can tell, 4 books has now become the standard number of books that I read each month. I'm always trying to strive to read more each month, but I find that my average ends up being like a book a week. But even then, I don't even read like a book a week. I end up like binging 2 over like 3 days and then like reading another one for like 2 whole weeks and then binging another one on the last day of the month. So my reading is very all over the place, and whenever I can get snatches of time and whenever I'm not having like a mental breakdown. So I really want to read more next month, as I say every month, but yes, I'm excited for May and I have some really exciting books that I'm going to be picking up. So go check out my May TBR if you haven't already. I will leave it linked on the screen or down below. But let's get into my wrap up. For those of you who are new here to my channel in 2021 at least, my wrap ups are a little bit different this year. I usually start these off by telling you all the books that I read during the month, and then I will go into each book and tell you about my non-spoiler thoughts and then also my spoilery thoughts. And so those will all be time-stamped on the time bar and also in the description, so you can just jump to the parts and the books that you want to hear about. And if you don't want to get spoiled on something, you don't have to be, and hopefully you will enjoy my thoughts on all these books. Alright, so the 4 books that I read during April were these. So I did a reread of Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo, one of my all-time fave series, and obviously I reread this in preparation for the show that came out at the end of April, and guys, I loved it so much. If you haven't seen my full review of the show, go check it out. It has like a comparison of like things that changed from the books. It has like my favorite moments between each of the couples, and it also has like some of my theories for the next season of the show, God willing that we have one. So yeah, I really love how that video turned out, so go check it out. And then after Shadow and Bone, I read Charming as a Verb by Ben Philippe. I kind of picked this up on a whim and I listened to it via the audiobook and it was fantastic, so stay tuned for the thoughts on this. And then I also picked up Days of Distraction by Alexandra Chang. If you have seen my Come Book Shopping With Me vlog or Instagram Controls My Day vlog, I actually buy this book while I'm book shopping, and it actually showed up like a couple days after I had filmed that video. I hadn't yet picked up an adult book for the month, so this was my adult book and it was fantastic. Probably a new all-time favorite, but I'll talk about it a little bit more in a second. And then the last book I picked up was Honey Girl by Morgan Rogers. I really love this one also. This was also a book that I picked up on a whim. I had it on my TBR I think in February or March, I want to say. I did also buy this one on a book shopping trip, actually in person that time, which was really nice. But this one I had intended to pick up earlier and then I never got around to it. And then I finished Days of Distraction and I wanted something sort of similar. Both of them are quite similar in the sense that they involve these young women who are going through a kind of coming of age moment or upheaval in their life in their mid to late 20s. And so they are both written very differently, but they have that idea going on. So I really enjoyed Days of Distraction, so I wanted something similar in content, so I picked this up, and I also really loved it for very different reasons. But yes, those are the 4 books. If you just wanted like a general sense of what I read during the month, I guess you can stop here. But if you want to hear my in-depth thoughts on each of these books, stay tuned for the non-spoiler and spoiler reviews. Okay, so let's get into non-spoiler thoughts about Shadow and Bone. I don't even know if there's a point about talking about non-spoiler thoughts because most of you have read this by now or you have seen the show, so there's nothing really to be spoiled. But I will say it was so nice to jump back into this world. I did also do a reading vlog for this where I read like the first, I want to say like 100 pages in that vlog. So if you haven't seen that, go check that out if you just wanted like a chill vlog to watch and more Shadow and Bone love. As usual, I just freaked out a lot over Melina moments because Mal and Alina are my one true loves. I love them as a couple, and I love their friends to lovers kind of relationship. And one of the things that was interesting about this reread, this is the 3rd time I'm rereading it, was that I was able to compare it to the last 2 times I've read it. I read this for the first time in high school, I want to say, and I just got really wrapped up in the story and absolutely loved it, and I loved like the subsequent books as well. But I think my perspective really changed on it, especially to do with Melina when I read it for the 2nd time in 2018. And then reading it for the 3rd time in 2021, it was funny because when I read it the 2nd time I had left little notes on my copy, and so reading it this third time I was able to see those annotations and I was like, oh, this is interesting, or like, you thought this, and most of it I still agree with. It was just funny seeing the stuff that like I had written, but this time I sort of tabbed a bunch of places in the book because I was just so excited by so many scenes, and I was trying to tab scenes or like lines that I really wanted to see adapted, and I have some feelings about how they sort of dealt with the Shadow and Bone storyline in the show, and I wish they had shown us a little bit more, but you can go check out my review for more thoughts on that aspect of the adaptation. But yeah, overall, it was fantastic rereading this again, and I cannot wait to reread the other books later on. That's about all the non-spoiler thoughts I have. Let's get into spoilers. So, I don't know what else to say. I found it really interesting because this time I was like, it was really interesting to watch the Darkling and everything that he was saying to Alina and the way that he was sort of manipulating her. And I had noticed this the second time and had that fog removed from my brain from the first time I had read it, when, you know, you just like fall in love with him. But it was just really interesting to read it this third time and notice these things more and just be really focused on Alina as a character and her emotional growth. And I think I just like had so many like heart-wrenching moments just reading the second half of this with all of the Melina moments, because I was like, oh my god, my heart. And I was just so excited about all of the lines that I was hoping they would adapt. And there was a lot that they did, but there was also a lot that they didn't, and I'm really sad about that. I talked about this in my review of the show, but they didn't include Mal's epic speech at the end of this book. And for those of you who are not Melina shippers, you're gonna be like, oh my god, like, I don't care, whatever. But no, like, anyone who is a Melina shipper from the books, you know that that speech at the end of the book is just so powerful and it's just so sweet. And not getting to see that in the show was like kind of sad, but I mean, like, we get to see that all sort of dramatized, but I think it would have made a lot of sense to see Mal confess everything to Alina and kind of see from her perspective that she had realized, oh, that he had like done all this stuff to get to her. But regardless, still loved it. Yeah, I don't have much more to say about this. I did read it really, really quickly, so I don't feel like I spent too much time thinking about it, but I will say that I love how they adapted certain parts of this book, even though I was unhappy with other parts. Like, I liked how they maximized on some of the side characters like Alexei and Fedor, but I was really sad that we didn't get as much with like Botkin and like all the stuff in the Little Palace. And I did find that the show really tried to humanize the Darkling more than he is in the book. I feel like his actions, you can tell, are a lot more manipulative and that he's sort of playing Alina throughout the book, but I feel like in the show they were trying to make him seem a lot nicer than he was, and I think he comes off a little bit crueler in the book, which I liked better. Like, even towards the end during that sandskiff scene, he just like throws Mal to the Volcra and is like gonna let them die, and he impulsively decides to destroy Novokibirsk. I can't say that word. So I think there's just something so much more villainous about him, I think, from the books that I wish they had adapted into the show. But there were still some really great moments in the show as well. But I do think that, to a certain extent, the Shadow and Bone storyline was a little bit underdeveloped, especially with like Alina's growth in the Little Palace, and I wish we had just gotten to see more of it. Alright, next I picked up Charming as a Verb, as I said, and this is by Ben Philippe, who is also the author of The Field Guide to a North American Teenager, I want to say. Yes, and I picked this up on a total whim. The Epic Reads team at HarperCollins sent this to me, as they do with many of their books, because I have a whole series with them called #EpicBookRecs. If you haven't seen it yet, go check it out. I just recommend a bunch of YA books based off of certain themes each month. So this one I recommended for like a spring book recs video. So in part I picked this up to kind of prepare for that video, but I also just was like curious. It seemed like a really fun book and kind of like a cute YA contemporary that I would enjoy, and it's also the type of thing that I end up devouring very easily. YA contemporaries are the type of thing that I will just like read in a day or two, and I feel really happy afterwards because I finished a book, and they're also often really cute and adorable and fun. So yeah, this was no different. It follows our main character, Henry Holtwanger, so everyone calls him Halty, and he lives in New York City. He is the son of Haitian immigrants, and he always has these schemes to kind of earn more money and save up for college. And so he has this like dog walking scheme going on where he created like this fake agency, dog walking agency, to convince more like people in New York to kind of hire him as a dog walker because they don't want to just hire like a random teenager, but you know, thinking that he comes from like this fancy agency, Uptown Up Dogs, they are more likely to hire him. And he's also able to like charge them more and that kind of thing. So he has like this whole hustle going on. And then our love interest slash other main character in the book is Corinne Troy, and she lives in the same building as Halty. Her mother is a professor at Columbia, and she's just like this really highly achieving, tightly woven, and very intense character. She just wants to do really well in school, but she also knows that her social skills are kind of lacking, and that's what one of her guidance counselors said. And so she finds out about Halty's less than honest hustle going on. And so she sort of threatens him and blackmails him into helping her with her social life so that she can seem a little bit better to her guidance counselor, who is also doing the references for her college applications. So it's just like really cute sort of she's all that situation, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in the spoiler section, but overall it was really cute. Like just the sort of little romance between them was adorable, but I think the main focus was on Halty as a character and how he's just this charming guy who has always found his way into things, and when things don't go quite the way he planned, this is the story of how he starts to realize that he can't always get things the way he wants and he needs to be a little bit more honest to himself. Let's talk about spoilers now. So as I said, this was sort of a like she's all that situation, but it really doesn't become that. Like it starts off that way, but it doesn't continue that way because the focus is really on Halty. And so Corinne actually does change a little bit for like the first party that they go to, but that's about all of the like blackmailing and she's all that situation that the book has, because she sort of picks up on these like cues and, you know, ways to interact better with people, and then she just sort of does that because she's just very like smart person. But then after that, it's like turns into this really cute romance between them, but they also start like dating quite quickly. And I think the whole story really more revolves around Halty as a character and his struggle with like his identity, how he has pinned so much of his hopes on going to Columbia because his father wants him to. And then there's also like this whole like side plot of like, you know, him also applying to McGill in Quebec in Canada, which I thought was interesting, and how he is like thinking about going there for like design because he wants to be a shoe designer. And I just love like that whole aspect, and it really kind of focused on senior year feeling of trying to figure out what you're going to do next. But one of the things that I really hated about this, and it was so interesting because I was loving this book like for the first 70%, I absolutely loved it. And then we reached this part where Halty uses Corinne's mother's computer to send an email to the admissions department of Columbia to get himself admitted into the university. It was just so frustrating to see him like make this one really, really bad decision. And it sort of spoke to his like character from earlier on because he was doing these like dishonest things. So when he actually did that though, because he like has a moment where he's like, no, you shouldn't be doing this. And then he walks away. And I was like, okay, good. Like, good job. But then he walks back and does the bad thing. And I was so upset, especially because of like the rift that it causes between him and Corinne. We later find out that Corinne had made this entire case to her mother on the plane for their trip to write a letter of recommendation for Halty, and so her mother comes home to do that and finds out all of this. And so it was just like so heartbreaking to see that and seeing how he like gets accepted and then has the acceptance like ripped away from him all because of his own actions. And it was just, yeah, so heartbreaking to watch. I do like how it kind of like came to a resolution and how like him and Corinne kind of find their way back to each other after a few years and like later in college, which was cool. It was a little bit hard to believe that she would forgive him, but I guess like with time it makes sense. And also he was just being like a dumb teenager, so I get it, and he was under a lot of pressure. That was like the one like curveball in this book that I did not expect because it was going so happy for most of the book. So I even thought that like the third act wouldn't even be that like intense, but here we are. So yeah, it was good though. I really enjoyed it. Just a really fun YA contemporary, and I loved being in Halty's head too because he's such a like charmer. And it's also interesting because there's so few YA books written from the like male perspective, so that was also like a fun perspective to be in. Okay, next I picked up a totally different book, which was Days of Distraction by Alexandra Chang. And as I said, I picked this up on a total whim. I had bought the book after that Come Shopping With Me vlog, and the reason I wanted to pick it up was because I had seen it on Alexandria's Instagram. I've talked about Alexandria like multiple times because I get so many good recommendations from her, so go check her out. She has a YouTube channel and also an Instagram, so go check them both out. But yeah, so I'd seen her post about this book and I was like, oh, this seems interesting. I feel like I might enjoy this, but I like hadn't remembered what the actual description of the book was. I just knew that like I was interested in it the first time I saw it on her Instagram. So I was like, okay, I'll just buy it and like see how it goes because I wanted more adult books to read, and it was also on sale, so that was great. And I had finished Charming as a Verb quite a few days ago, and I was trying to finish the Gilded Ones, but still couldn't really get into that one. So I wanted something a little bit different that was also sort of real life and not fantasy, but I didn't want another YA contemporary. And so I was like, oh, let's maybe try this. So I literally picked it up one night and like I wasn't really feeling great as well. And I started reading it and I got sucked, and it was so freaking good. This is probably like one of my new all-time favorite books. And I can't explain to you exactly why. Objectively, I can see why a lot of people may not like this book, but I think it's just so interestingly done, and it was so relatable in so many instances, and I felt like there was like lines in this book that were like directly taken from my brain. And overall, it was just like a really interesting story and very autobiographical story. You find out as you're reading it that this is very much based off of the author's life and her own personal experiences, so it's like part of memoir, I would even say, but also fictionalized. But yeah, it's the story of this woman in her mid-20s facing an upheaval in her life. She's a woman of color, she is Asian, she's Chinese. A lot of the book is her examining her relationship to being a person of color in predominantly white spaces, whether that's in like the workspace, in her relationship with a white man, or just in like regular life, and seeing how, you know, her own history and her own heritage has kind of been eroded. But I just loved it overall, and one of the main reasons I loved it was because of the format of the book too, because not only does it take the first person perspective of the main character, but you also are getting these snippets of like conversation and also parts of articles and stuff that are thrown into the book that kind of add to whatever theme she's kind of talking about. So she'll be like talking about her life and like things that are going on and whatever else, but then those scenes will be interjected with like little snippets. And so one from like the very beginning that I remember, which I thought was really cool. So it's like an office and two interns, and I think it's at like her office as well. And so one of the interns says, "Where'd you learn to make this?" The other person responds, "From a photo one of my friends posted on Instagram." "Is your friend a chef?" "Yeah." "Do you have a lot of chef friends on Instagram?" "Yeah, but wait, are they really your friends or just people you found on there? Like, do you really know them and care about them?" And then the other person responds, "Oh sure, they're my good friends and I care about them a lot. They just don't know I exist." And I thought that that was such a good like passage of like what it feels like to be on social media these days. Like you have these people that you follow on social media and you really care about their lives and you're so invested in everything, but they don't know that you exist. And it's just so funny, and you like treat them like a friend, but they're not really your friend. They're just someone you follow. So yeah, there's like little pieces of conversation like that that are like thrown into the story. And then later on, there's more like parts that are from like history or from articles or different quotes that the main character herself is sort of interacting with and that relate to what she's kind of doing in the book. And so that was also really interesting as well. But yeah, overall, this is like a really cool, interesting book. It is like a mesh of multiple things, but I think overall like the main character's thought processes in the book was just so interesting, and I just loved her voice as well. And she also has this way of like writing that is like very to the point and very blunt and doesn't seem emotional, but like portrays so much emotion, if that makes sense. Okay, so in terms of spoilers, I think one thing that bothered me a little bit about this book, even though I absolutely loved it, was the ending, but I also think it speaks to the way that this book was written and like how it is as a book, and so I wouldn't have expected anything different. But I do feel like there wasn't like a complete resolution at the end about her relationship. She spends a lot of time, especially in like the second half of the book, questioning her relationship with Jay, and at the end it just ends up being him picking her up from the airport. He has finally read the articles that she gave him, and I thought that that was like really interesting, the way that she's not ready to let go of him, and I think it makes sense, you know, they've been through a lot together. It was just interesting, like it wasn't like this big grand moment, if that makes sense, but it still comes to a logical conclusion and resolution. I just think that we're so used to these like really big moments at the end of books and big realizations at the end, but really it's like this slow and steady process of her thinking that there's something wrong and then realizing that, you know, maybe it's still good, maybe it's still okay. And I kind of like that. It's like a different story format, which I liked. In terms of specific things that I really loved from the book, you know, I loved the format, I loved the main character's voice, but I also really loved all of the parts at work. Like I really, really enjoyed, I think, the first third of the book where she was at her office of mainly white people and all of the little microaggressions that she is facing, but also just like different things that are going on, how like no one can remember her name or how she keeps getting passed up for a promotion. Also just like the politics of things going going on in her office. Like, I just found all of that super interesting. And I loved that she was also a writer in a tech space. If you've ever worked in like a tech related company, there's like a certain type of culture there. And so it was interesting to see that in this book as well, and how she like ends up working for Facebook at one point too, which I thought was like so insidious because I did not expect it to be Facebook that she was working for. I just thought it was like some random site, but it ended up being Facebook, which I thought was super interesting. And she was like collecting these articles and stuff for them. And also how they sort of censored her as well. Like there was one article that she wanted to bring up about, you know, how there's not enough women in tech, that kind of thing. And they told her, we don't think this is good, so we cut that one out. And I thought that that was really interesting. And then also later on, like when she ends up moving to Ithaca with her boyfriend, the parts where she's like working from home, I thought was really interesting too, because it reflected a lot of like the emotions you feel working from home during the pandemic. Like I felt like she was going through a lot of similar things that a lot of us are feeling now as well. So I related to those parts as well, which was interesting. And yeah, I think there's just so many things that were just so like honest about this book and like touched upon some very real things. And so in that way, like I really appreciated it and enjoyed it because it was like, oh my god, I feel like I'm reading my own thoughts. And I also just really loved the parts where she ends up working for that museum and she finds this photo of Yame Kin and starts researching her. And I found that whole journey of her researching that woman from like the early 1900s, of her life as like this Asian woman, very successful woman, and how her relationship with like a white man kind of deteriorates. Like that whole part was just so interesting, and how she was trying to draw parallels between Yame's life and her own, and how sometimes it didn't really line up. And so it was just really interesting. And also how she researches and examines all of these laws and rules against Asian Americans, and also how they were like portrayed in a lot of the media and reporting around those times. Overall, a really, really cool book. If you somehow decided to stay for my spoiler thoughts but haven't read this book, go pick it up because it's so cool and so interesting, and I just loved it so much. Okay, so I've been talking for ages, but we're on to the last book of this wrap up, and that is Honey Girl by Morgan Rogers. So many people told me so many amazing things about this book. I had seen it everywhere on social media when it came out, and I had been convinced by that fervor for it, and I ended up picking it up at the bookstore one day, and I'm so glad I did because it was really interesting and I actually really loved it, especially after having picked up Days of Distraction, which is very like detached and blunt and honest in the way that the author writes, where this one is a very similar situation of a person of color working in a, you know, predominantly white space, you know, feeling that disconnect, and also a woman in her late 20s going through an upheaval and realizing that she's been working towards something that maybe she doesn't really want, and it was just so interesting. But yeah, basically Honey Girl is about this woman named Grace Porter. She is half black, half white, and the book begins with her waking up in Las Vegas, and she has drunkenly gotten married to another woman, a stranger that she does not know, and the stranger has left sort of a like card. Grace is like left with these memories of like this wonderful night with this woman, and Grace is a very like by the book person. She has always followed a certain plan that her father has laid out for her and that she has laid out for herself, and so she makes this kind of mistake and returns home to Portland, and she's facing this moment in her career as well of trying to figure out what to do next and not feeling like she can move forward and feeling like she's done all this work up until now for nothing. And I don't want to get too much into it because I feel like I'll spoil it. I will say not much happens in this book. I feel like a lot of it is an internal journey that Grace goes through, but there's a really sweet romance in here and just some really beautiful moments of like Grace getting to know herself and being surrounded by a really beautiful support system and just coming to understand herself, which was just really beautiful. And I think I hadn't expected initially where it was going to go by the end, and I really love where it went, if that makes sense. Okay, and then in terms of spoilers, there's so many interesting things about this. I thought it was really interesting how Grace was facing this obstacle in getting a job after her PhD, and how her like supervisor thought she was a shoo-in for this position, but obviously all the white people who were interviewing her didn't think she was culturally a fit. And it was so interesting like seeing the struggles that she faced as a person of color in white academia, because that is like a huge thing if you've ever been in academia. But I also really loved the relationship she had with Yuki. That was so beautiful. I loved Yuki's podcast and the whole idea of like, are you out there, or are you listening? And like the different monsters that she talks about, that was so cool. Like I wish that was an actual podcast because I thought it was beautiful. And I just loved Yuki as a character. She was so cool. And I loved like their little relationship. It was just so beautiful and also a little bit convenient. I felt like it was so interesting that like they had accidentally gotten married, drunkenly married in Vegas, but they still really liked each other afterwards from like the get-go. So that was interesting. And then another thing I found interesting was like all of the friends that she had. I think that they were all great, like the support system that she has. And I also loved Yuki's friends, like all of her roommates. They were hilarious. And then there was that whole moment with like her and Raj in the bar, and like they get drunk and say some really mean things. And while I thought that that was interesting, I just felt like it was so secondary to what was going on, and I wasn't that invested with Raj's character before that moment, so I didn't see the real point in it. It felt like we got told a lot of things about these like side characters, but there wasn't much plot-wise going on with them to make me interested in them. Another thing that I thought was interesting is that there's a lot of time that passes in this book. Like she spends the entire summer with Yuki, but like in my head, I thought it had only been like a week. So that was like a little strange, like the way that the time kind of passed in this book. There's also like a bunch of time jumping later on towards the end when she's with her mother. So in that way, it was like slightly uneven in the pacing, but I think it was still an interesting journey of her kind of coming to terms with her mental health. But I think that aspect doesn't really become clear until much later. I do like the resolution of the book though, how it like ends with her mother's wedding and Yuki showing up and like all that. That was just really beautiful. And I think the relationship with her father was just so interesting. I feel like I wish we got more of it, or his like behavior was just so contradictory that like I just didn't know what to think half the time. But it's so interesting how she was like living up to all these expectations he had for her and how he was pressuring her so much. And even when she was like kind of pushing back on that and trying to tell him I need a break and that kind of thing, he still kept telling her like you can't give up, that sort of thing. And she has this moment where she's like, you know, in her head she could sort of see how her father had become like this big bad in her life and, you know, in the journey of her mental health, but she realizes that he's just a person as well, and like he just wanted the best for his daughter. And I think that that was like a really beautiful realization. All right, but those are the 4 books that I read during April. I really hope you enjoyed this video and hearing my thoughts on each of them. I think it was an overall really great reading month. Like I really enjoyed all 4 books, and I'm excited to see if I'll enjoy what I read in May. But if you haven't already, go check out my Twitter, Instagram, and Goodreads in the description down below for regular reading updates. And I will see you in my next video. So please remember that this story ain't over. Bye!